Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. This video, as you might have figured, is called Science and Anarchy, and here I wish to discuss with you, let's say, the dynamics, the evolutionary dynamics of science in the span of a couple of centuries at least. So we shall hopefully trace how this ugly duckling of science turned into this huge, terrible, duck-like monster, so to speak, and basically sort of submitted the whole society to it. And I believe that the same transition actually happened elsewhere, so perhaps this is sort of like a cultural archetype or something, but we'll discuss all that sometime down the line in this video. So, my main point here is that basically science actually occupied almost like diametrically opposite societal positions, so to speak, at its inception, which is like 17th century roughly speaking, and at its very peak and the beginning of rapid decay in the 20th century. I wouldn't be talking about the decay of science, that would be the topic of one of the next videos, not like immediately some of the next ones, but somewhere later, maybe a couple of months later, but we'll see. So the science, in my opinion, has changed its role, changed its mode of being, essentially, from being like a timid child, you know, like peeping from behind the skirt of its mother, which is religion, obviously, so at its inception it was exactly that, like this timid child, and so only like a few bold individuals were like bold enough basically to stray away from its mother, so to speak, from religion, and they were quite frequently spanked for that, obviously, and sometimes not even staying alive after this procedure. I mean, speaking about Giordano Bruno and people like that. But now science itself has turned into this woman of ample proportions, so to speak, a mother of the family, etc., etc., and basically it has substituted religion in this role, right? So that's basically the main point that I'm gonna make in this video, that from this bold beginning, a blind throw into the unknown, science has turned into some sort of like domestic everyday activity, you know, very fixed and regulated by a multitude of institutions and rules, etc., etc., and tightly integrated into the whole, into the society and its daily practices. And all the asocial or even antisocial tendencies that were present in the initial phase of science have been completely eliminated, essentially, and what we have right now is like a very socialized and normalized behavior, for which obviously, I mean in science, for which we obviously have to pay a price of lacking creativity, lacking individuality, lacking any kind of progress, basically, any kind of significant progress. What we have is only some cosmetic enhancements here and there. Discussion of novel ideas in science by rare individuals have turned into this very heavy, immovable web, right? Very interconnected, but very heavy, which kind of keeps digesting over and over the same stray flies of former originality, basically. That's what science is about since like the middle of 20th century, really, which was probably its peak. Even arguably its peak was at the beginning of 20th century. Like the middle of 20th century is already the phase of the decline. And so a voice of a single person in such a system obviously is drowned in this ocean of collectivism, of you might say mutual references, log rolling, peer review, government expenditures and grants, all this kind of stuff, like nepotism and corruption. So in this regard, scientific community isn't anything different from any other community, really. And all these political aspects that I've quite extensively rambled about in my video on pseudoscience are present in scientific community, obviously, in a large way, just like in any other community. So in this sense, scientific community isn't a single bit more liberal or democratic or objective than any other community. It's the same power play, essentially, the dynamics of power ensembles. That's what determines the scientific community, just like any other community again. So, and it might not be fair in this regard, just like any other community. So, but somehow it's rarely acknowledged, that somehow it's still considered that science and politics are something separate, that, scientists are somehow very objective people or something, and that science itself is like still considered to be discovering some sort of objective laws of nature and stuff, and spreading them through the society, right? But again, in my videos about pseudoscience, about potential energy, about Einstein and Hawking, I've already discussed like what science really does, how it really works. Like science, again, from my video about potential energy, for example, I'll just repeat my point that science is not concerned with discovery of truth, but rather what science does is it constructs objects, essentially, that help us to project our power into the world. Okay, so, and yeah, so in politics, like people kind of can see easily, more or less, that there are problems in society and there are various approaches to solving these problems, represented, for example, by various political parties, right? Like, well, you get the idea, hopefully. So people understand that, and they understand that there is a need of discussion. Well, hopefully they do, at least. And you cannot solve these problems anyway without a discussion, right? And all societies, as much as they exist, should possess at least some sort of discussion, Like sometimes this discussion might take like radical forms. Like if you suppress, let's say, freedom of speech, if you suppress your political opponents, well, obviously they would tend to turn into extremists and terrorists and etc., because, well, they don't have any other way of sending their political message, right? So it's not a very good idea to suppress your political opponents. A good idea is to have a open discussion about things. But somehow in science, we don't have that recognition. Somehow, again, it's still considered that there is an objective truth. That's one point. Then the second point is that the objective truth is single, like there's only one objective truth. And third point is that the scientific community possesses this objective truth. So you can clearly see how it creates this political justification for suppression of any other alternative opinion. And obviously it plays, well, let's say it enhances the natural tendency of corruption of political ensembles. So scientific political ensembles, because they possess this faith in their own ultimate correctness, let's say, they have this moral justification to suppress all the other alternative opinions, and it's really not very healthy. Again, just as I've made an example with political powers, like political in the regular sense of the word. And so, you know, if you think about all these suppression of alternative ideas in the sense of, you know, all these fact-checking or whatever, or like banning like groups that spread the information you don't like, or something like that, it's not gonna end very well, you know. That's what I'm saying. So so the discussion of changing this established truth, which is again supposedly really objective truth, etc., etc., whereas again, returning to my previous points in other videos, it's really a result of consensus. It's not something inherently present in the world. It's something that has been constructed in scientific community, essentially. So the discussion about changing this truth is at best just removed to the corridors. You know, it's never performed in the open, at least in the places where it should be performed, like scientific journals or scientific conferences, etc., etc. Again, as I've said, without external transparency, scientific community becomes basically a paradise for corruption. And well, the question might arise: why is there no external transparency? Why is there no external control? And I think one word to answer that question would be dogmatization, because science, again, is the new religion, as I've clearly stated in my Einstein and Hawking video. And I mean, it's not a big surprise. Like, we've had religion to govern our way of doing things. And since religion is now pushed back by science itself, well, now we shall use science, right? It's a very logical conclusion, even though obviously science cannot replace religion in many aspects, which again leads to nihilism and all those things like that. So again, if science is by current default like the final arbiter of all the decisions, then who's gonna control and correct scientists themselves? Basically, they became these like true Brahmins, you know, since like the decision and conclusions of one scientist might only be challenged by another scientist. It couldn't be anyone else. Like, no one else has enough power to, let's say, push back a scientist other than some other scientist. That's what I'm saying. In the current society, at least in the Western society that we more or less all live in. So, and for this other scientist to succeed, he'd better be, you know, somewhere higher up in the hierarchy of scientific community to, I mean, successfully criticize the first guy. And so we arrive at this vicious circle in some sense, because in scientific community, you need to be heard to get to the top, right? But at the same time, to be heard, you need to be at the top already, right? So it's this negative selection in some sense. There's no social lift for a scientist, at least like a clear one, and that's another instrument. Well, not exactly an instrument, but another reason for this closedness of the scientific community, I guess, this negative feedback, where only the people who are on top are able to speak, And so, like, basically, yeah, which means that this system would more or less solidify. No new people would come up, you know. Only, like, again, as this famous quote by Planck, that, you know, new ideas, well, I'm obviously paraphrasing, but, like, new ideas only succeed because the people who held old ideas die out, right? So it's like literally only dying out of the top of the hierarchy is what brings the next lower level on the top, right? That's how this system renews itself, so to speak. But there's no healthy metabolism in it, so to speak. So, yeah, so that's another, again, reason for its closeness, yeah, I guess. And it creates this very closed community, this sort of social club out of science. Another thing that helps this process is probably the quite unimaginable and sometimes I would say artificial complexity of sciences. It's the and obviously also specialization. Like there's a thing that modern Russian thinker Sergei Pereslegin calls the Leibniz limit. And what he means by that is that, well, roughly speaking, Leibniz is considered to be like the last person who could have single-handedly be an expert in all scientific fields at once, at least all the contemporary scientific fields, right? So after that, it branched outwards too much. So you couldn't be an expert in everything at once, right? So there's this problem. So, which means that it's so over-specialized that there's no internal criticism, even internal criticism for that reason, that even a physicist cannot criticize many other physicists because, well, they clearly are so specialized that they've gone so deeper into this mind, so to speak, that he can't even see them, you know. They have their own language, their own terminology, their own sets of values in some sense, sets of notions, concepts, ideas, abstractions, objects, relations between these objects, etc., etc. So this thing also helps a lot in closing the scientific community, even from itself in some sense, right? Like building internal walls in the community. So it all helps to conserve the status quo. You might think, perhaps, I thought about this analogy, about science as sort of like a factory where, like, it became so large and so complex that there's no one who can even understand, who can even see it all at once, and who can even closely understand what the factory is doing, you know. There's one section where people can more or less cooperate and they do something, and then they produce some weird tool or whatever, and they just pass it on to the other section, and the other section, like, they have no idea what this thing does, but they have their own sort of procedures, and they sort of do something to it, and blah, blah, blah. And so, but many of these sections aren't even connected, you know. So, yeah. So nobody really knows what science is doing, and it got out of control so much that it's basically beyond salvation in some sense. But again, I'll talk about that in some other video, that probably science is going to disappear pretty soon. So, yeah, and so all of that works in favor of hiding all the illnesses and failures of science from the public, essentially. Like, everything appears to be known and discovered already, you know, in the, like, mainstream media discourse, or at least, you know, everything would be soon known and discovered. You just send a little bit more money, and we'll make everything work, basically. And another huge reason for that, again, the lack of transparency, is the atrophy of scientific media, obviously, because this dogmatization of science itself, this internal solidification, plus its incredible complexity, it basically turns scientific journalism into a megaphone, like a megaphone of some flagrant propaganda, without even a shadow of discussion. But again, I've talked about that quite a bit in my video about Einstein and Hawking. And so the vessel of scientific community, abstractly speaking, metaphorically speaking, again, I've talked about Planck already, so, you know, this analogy of black body is like you have a vessel that has its internal layering is very absorbent, and you just like puncture a little hole in this whatever box, let's call it, and if you look inside, it would look like completely black, right? Because all the rays that come inside this hole, they would like multiple times re-reflected, reabsorbed, re-emitted, and basically all you get as the output is like this black body radiation. So that's what scientific community looks like. Like wherever you puncture a hole in it, you wouldn't see anything. It's so closed, it's so black inside. That's what I'm saying, essentially. So you would only at best encounter, and by the way, I would make a video specifically about like, you know, this cultural phenomenon of press release, scientific press releases. We'll talk about that again maybe in a couple of months from now. But in all those press releases, you at best would see some stupid crap like scientists from Boston Institute of Purple Tutti Fruities have cloned graphene sepulchres or something like that. And by the way, I'll probably leave a link in the description to my Facebook post where I've like deliberately produced some press release like that. Okay, so again, in political media, we have like sane people can see that political media are biased, right? It's not, and like in fact all the political media are biased. It's just that whether you prefer their type of bias or not, then you might say, well, these are unbiased, you know, these are true. The one that I like, they're really true political media, right? But all the other ones are biased. But if you're a sane person, you probably understand that they're all biased. And everyone recognizes that, hopefully at least. But in scientific world, it's quite the contrary. It's considered that it is true, like whatever is said. And so all these discussions in scientific communities, they never, or rather they rarely like bleed out, seep out into the media. Like only recently I remember a couple of examples of this sort of debate in the media about gravitation, for example. There was Eric Verlinde with his emergent gravity, entropic gravity. That was one example. And well, Mike McCulloch with his gravity also was in the media, but not as much as Verlinde. And what else was there? Well, okay. Well, since we're talking about gravity, there were also reports about MOND, modified Newtonian dynamics, being somewhat discussed, like maybe a couple of articles per year. That's what you would see on these topics. But at least that's something, you know. Okay, and but mostly you would see this sort of propagandist type of crap, the example of which I've given above. And yeah, so the pluralism is utterly lacking in scientific media. And there's no discussion, there's no consideration of different options or alternatives or different opinions. And there's only these, Sunday worships of science, like praising science and repeating objective scientific truths and all that stupid crap, like all these quasi-military propaganda posters, basically, that happily announced that today we've conquered another part of the front from the unknown, or if we haven't, we are baffled by our discoveries, so please send us money. That's what they say, like, the enemy is too strong, please send more money. Something like that. So, and that's very sick. But somehow I'm really far from my anarchy topic. I don't really know how I got this far. Okay, so well, probably one last point I would add to this whole debate of the last 20 minutes is that, well, imagine a political system, again, using the same analogy. Imagine a political system where the current government would decide who's going to enter the next government. Like not the people, but the government itself would decide that. Like you might think, well, that sounds insane. That sounds like barbarism, which certainly like drives, it's like almost by definition, the corruption, right? It's insane, and it's like this system isn't gonna stay up very long, right? Because it has no feedback with the society. Basically, like there's a strict divide between the people in power and the regular people. Now, I'm not going to discuss like whether it's true for supposedly democratic countries or not, like including the Western world. That's a separate discussion. But imagine if it was like by definition, as I've described, like it was the law that the current government appoints the next government. Like, it's insane, right? But in science, like, it's exactly what's going on. Like, only scientists could allow, like, top-ranked scientists could allow other scientists to get up, to get more scientific power, so to speak, right? Like, through various instruments, like, again, grants, citation is a perfect instrument for that. Like giving someone positions at universities or research institutes, prizes like Nobel Prize or whatever, the right to be published in a journal, the right to speak at the conference, blah, blah, blah. Like there's infinitely many of these instruments of redistributing power in the scientific community, right? And it works exactly like that. Or peer review is another instrument like that. Like it's the scientists in the field who are going to decide whether this particular work deserves to be published, for example, right? So it's corruption, like by definition. Okay. So yeah, I've probably discussed that enough. So now let's get back to the initial topic of anarchy. So, like, again, my point that I made at the very beginning was that science has changed, like, to a diametrically opposed societal role, so to speak. And in the initial science, there was exactly this, what I would call anarchistic drive, this desire to get rid of authority, essentially, which is pretty anarchistic, right? And the desire to release people from religious indoctrination, let's say, the desire to give people, or at least to show people, that there is an alternative, that you can come up with an alternative way of looking at world, etc. So all of that eventually got dead at some point. And science has turned, instead of being this releasing anarchistic endeavor, it has turned into something scholasticized, dogmaticized, very regulated, ordered, and with a well-established internal hierarchy, essentially. So it kind of turned into a church, right, itself. And I've mentioned at the beginning that it has happened already in other places, or at least in one place. So what do I mean by that? And in particular, I mean the church itself, the Christian church. Because, and here I should say that it's not exactly my idea. Like I've come to this idea from reading Tolstoy and Nietzsche. And Nietzsche actually got this idea from Tolstoy, so you might say that it's Tolstoy's idea. Which is kind of funny because, I'll just tell you this little anecdote, because so Tolstoy had this idea that, well, okay, I'll just describe the idea. So the idea is that the initial pathos of Christ was that of anarchy, fundamentally. Like, he was saying that the Christ, according to Tolstoy, was saying that, well, basically, screw you with your societal hierarchy. There should be no power of one person over other person, one human being over other human being, because there's a God and all the human beings are equal in front of him, So one human being cannot, rule over other human being because there's a God and he kind of equalizes everyone. So that was the idea of Tolstoy. I think I've mentioned that in my Onion of Aliens video, like part 3 probably, where I've discussed the reasons for equality. So, yeah, so Tolstoy had this idea, and Nietzsche have been reading Tolstoy's writings, but the diaries of Nietzsche were later, I'm not sure exactly, but I think Nietzsche read Tolstoy in French, so he made diaries also in French, I guess, or maybe in German, I don't know. So, but anyway, long story short, so these diaries of Nietzsche were later copied by someone and brought to Tolstoy, who didn't know that Nietzsche was actually, it was a stenographically written down text of Tolstoy himself, so he read Nietzsche reading his own text, Tolstoy read Tolstoy in Nietzsche's interpretation, basically, in literal sense. So, and he was reading and saying, wow, this guy has an incredibly similar views to mine. That was kind of funny. So, yeah, so, and the idea was such that, indeed, the initial idea of Christianity, I guess, was anarchistic. It was against hierarchy, and by the way, against how do you say it? Religious hierarchy, against the church, the Judaism or whatever. So you might think about this idea that to Caesar things that are Caesar's, to God the things that are God's. Like, basically, screw you, Mr. Caesar, we have our God and that's enough for us, So we are equals and you have your own wicked hierarchies, etc., etc. So that's essentially an anarchistic pathos, I would say. It's pretty clear, I think. Don't step on snake, something like that. And ironically, obviously, this anarchistic Christianity was adopted by the empire itself, by the Roman Empire, and turned into a hierarchy of itself. So a Christian church appeared, which is like absurd. Like it's an anarcho-fascism, you know, that type of stuff. But it's also very funny. So yeah, just goes to show that, yeah, it's kind of like a natural way of how things work. And by the way, that's another thing that I should have noted previously, that here I basically work with a version of history that is like currently adopted, you know, mainstream version of history, which was basically written by Jesuits in like 16th century. So in a way, I am studying a company, which is a Christian church in this particular case, by the writings of the employees of this company, which isn't the most healthy thing to do, you might say, but well, unfortunately, there's no other version of history as powerful as the one produced by the Jesuits. I would like there to be another version of history, but unfortunately, there's only like some attempts to reconfigure historical narrative. By the way, I'll make another video about history specifically. Again, maybe in a couple of months from now, but we'll see. I guess at some point I would run out of couples of months, you know, if I'll continue to make plans like that. But anyway, so what I've been talking about is that this Christian church appeared, right? Yeah. So that was the same type of transition from anarchy to hierarchy. And the same type of transition, I believe, happened in science as a, how do you say it, successor of religion, of Christianity in particular, that the anarchistic stage of science demolished religious hierarchy, or at least it's severely diminished its influence on society, and then science itself has transferred into the hierarchical stage, if you like, into this dogmatic church stage, right? So, oh yeah, and another interesting thing that I would like to note is that I think it's not a coincidence that, again, the same type of story repeated itself, because, and I would actually make quite a strong claim that, again, sort of vaguely is present in Nietzsche's texts, at least some ideas like that. Like Nietzsche was talking about the self-overcoming of a Christian, for example. Like his idea was that a Christian inherently has this high regard for truth, for example. And so, Nietzsche said, as the Christian pursues truth more and more, he would basically see that Christianity itself is a bunch of rubbish. And so, by being a good Christian, by pursuing truth, he would basically, well, again, self-overcome, like he would not be a Christian anymore. So in some sense, the better Christian you are, the less Christian you are. And in some sense, I would say that this was what happened with science. Like scientists are, paraphrasing Terrell, more Christians than Christians. That's my point basically. That scientists were trying to be true and honest, and through that they've demolished Christianity basically. So they were good Christians in this sense, right? In the full sense of the word, I would say. Yeah, so that's an idea that hopefully would be interesting to you. And like returning to the case of Tolstoy, what his point was with regards to this, to his note that initial Christianity was anarchistic, like he more or less tried to restore that, well, at least to some degree, that like the ideals of the initial Christianity. And I believe that if one tries to restore the ideals of the initial science in the current day and age, in this well, basically in society dominated by scientific worldview, right? If one is to restore the ideals of the initial science, one would have the same result as Tolstoy, essentially, which was anathema. Like he was excommunicated from the church for his deeds, for his views, essentially. And yeah, and we see examples of that like every day, or maybe you don't see, but I do, certainly, due to my interests, like all those heretics, you know, pseudoscientists. Again, see my video about pseudoscience if you're interested in this topic. And like, yeah, and it's quite a dangerous thing to be a heretic today. I mean, science of today is much more powerful than religion was in the days before. Like, our current governments are based on scientific presuppositions, and like our laws are based on science, etc., etc. And obviously, I mean, modern governments have like incomparably more tools of influencing people than, let's say, church had 500 years ago, right? So yeah, it's not a very good thing. Well, think about climatic issues, you know, like if you don't agree with the consensus, you might easily lose your job or reputation or even life, or at least health, you know. And it happens also in other branches of science to that degree or another. And again, like kind of moving closer to the end, I would say that this transition that I've described from anarchy to hierarchy, I think it has deep cultural roots, but I'm not quite sure where they lie, but I have a hypothesis that they lie actually in the individual life of a person, and in particular, male person. And I think maybe I've found this idea somewhere in Freud's writings, but I'm not sure about that. Or at least it sounds like something that he could have written. But anyway, supposedly it's my idea that the emulation of this cultural process is kind of like the emulation of the anarchistic rebellion of a man against his father, essentially. So a father as a symbol of hierarchy, right? And a man has to, in some sense, overthrow the government, so to speak, the hierarchy, the father. And he has to go outside, go beyond his family, right? Like break free. So that's anarchy, fundamentally. But that's only the first phase, obviously. But the second phase is when a man establishes his own family. And that's when he turns into a hierarchy himself. He becomes a father himself, right? So it's exactly this same transition, I would say, which is quite peculiar in my opinion. And like, you know, this proverbial dream of all the children not to repeat the mistakes of their parents, which obviously fails every time. Like every child more or less repeats the same mistakes. And yeah, sort of like that. So, and why do I think it should be male? Well, if you've seen my video about gender, you probably can figure it out quite easily. if you don't go and do that. I would just add that this anarchistic science is like purely male activity, cannot be female. Just as well as philosophy, for example. Like, think about any influential philosopher. Like, well, first of all, they are male, all of them, and secondly, well, they're all anarchists to that degree or another, you know. This, you know, spirit of Columbus, and I don't really care whether Columbus existed or not, in this context at least. This spirit that kind of says that, well, you know, everyone sails to the east, but in spite of everyone, like, I'm gonna sail to the west and succeed, like, you know, to make this huge slap in the face to everyone else, basically. Well, that's not a female spirit, you know. Like, basically, there's too much unnecessary risk, too much like blind, reckless self-confidence. I would say too much originality and some like boyish stupidity, and like stubbornness. And these are all our male traits, more or less. Again, see my gender video to see the reason for that. Like, men are the touchstone of all the evolutionary innovations. So any sort of risky throw on spec into the unknown is the purely male calling, essentially. Like, women are more about conservation, not about acquisition, because acquisition is risky. And we need to save women to save the population, essentially. So all these inventive endeavors are manifested through male part of the population, let's say. But again, that was the first phase, right? This anarchistic phase. But the second phase, when the hierarchy is already established, that's where women might succeed. And in fact, they might succeed even more than men in this case. Because, well, again, if you think about the analogy with the family, like, what really happens is that as the man overthrows one hierarchy, his father, and leaves and establishes his own hierarchy, well, sort of hierarchy. I mean, like a center of power, let's call it that. A woman might enter, and they would form a family, right? So, and again, not only a woman might enter, but she kind of should enter for the hierarchy to be stable, right? Because again, men are too chaotic on their own, when they have no purpose, so to speak. And women are often the thing that gives men purpose, because, well, obviously it's an access to reproduction, first and foremost. So, yeah. So that's why actually women have a lot of, let's say, prospects in the current phase of science. It's actually very depressing for men, because again, as I've said, there's no way of getting up the hierarchy, or like everything is against you getting up this hierarchy of scientific community. So men doesn't like that, you know, they don't like being at the very bottom of the hierarchy. But, I mean, but women are needed in this hierarchy to maintain it, essentially, to conserve it, exactly, because women are about conservation. But men are getting depressed because they cannot bring anything new, right? Because this thing is so old and stupid and rigged that men are not needed there, essentially. That's what I'm saying. And that's also another reason why science is doomed, I believe. Okay, so I guess we should conclude somewhere here. So I would say that Well, I basically considered this nonlinear process of development of science, where essentially there's like a dynamical competition between two forces, two tendencies. One tendency is the tendency for revolution, this anarchistic tendency, which again I would claim have started Christianity, again if we believe Jesuits, their version of history, and the one that have started science, right? That's one tendency, and the other tendency is this ever growing dogmatic crust over everything, this tendency to solidify everything that's mutable, and that have firstly created a Christian church out of anarchistic Christianity, and then it created a scientific church out of anarchistic initial science. So these are two main tendencies that seem to have brought the most important cultural shifts in the last, let's say 2,000 years if you believe Jesuits, but roughly 600 years, I would say, in some more reasonable version of history. Okay, and again, returning to my gender video, understanding gender, and I don't exactly remember which part, but onion avaliance, where I've also discussed the same problem, that it seems like both these tendencies actually originate in the very basis of life, which is genetic code. Like again, as I've repeated over and over, genetic code has two tasks, two main problems to solve, which are mutually exclusive. One problem is the need to conserve, to stay the same, and the other one is the need to adapt, which means the need to change, so not to stay the same, right? So they are mutually exclusive, and they are solved through this gender division, obviously. But here, it is the need to change that drives this anarchistic tendency, like male tendency, if you like, versus the need to conserve, which, again, obviously a female tendency, which drives this hierarchical, like solid, let's say, structure, like this regulated structure, right? And yeah, so basically this basic genetic contradiction, this basic pattern of genetic code seems to be manifesting itself on all these higher emergent levels, like the family, again, as I've given the example above, and the society, again, things like religion and science, and like a whole bunch of other smaller scale phenomena in society, and comparatively the same type of scale. Like maybe you can perhaps, well, again, the same theory of passionarity, I'm not sure if that's the thing in English, by Lev Gumilyov, the Russian thinker, or again the Oswald Spengler, this idea that civilizations basically have also this life cycle, where this, anarchistic tendency leads to this solidification and eventual decay, right? Okay, well, not anarchistic, but you know what I mean, basically this springing life, this mutability, this new beginning, etc., etc., which is kind of like chaos and anarchy. Okay, yeah, I've probably rambled enough, so hopefully I've made my point, or even hopefully a couple of ones. Yeah, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.